I understand the emotions of both sides of what happened on Saturday in the Horseshoe. I cannot lay blame on either side. College football has never been better. Interest has never been higher. I believe that we are at the dawn of the golden age of college football. It was an epic day of college football. It was one of those days where you fall in love with the sport all over again. Hey, welcome into the program. This is the Joel Klatt Show. I am Joel Klatt, and this show is brought to you by Hampton by Hilton. Thank you for being here, by the way. If you are listening to this podcast, wherever you're doing that, rate and review us if you would. Subscribe on YouTube, hit that notification button, leave a comment below, and then you can follow us on social media, wherever you like to social media, at Joel Klatt Show. A lot going on. Folks, rivalry weekend showed out, didn't it? Didn't it? There is so much to get into, and there's not going to be enough time. So some of these games I'm going to have to comment more specifically on Tuesday's reaction show, which you'll hear on Wednesday morning, because there's the Michigan-Ohio State game is going to take up a lot of time, and rightly so, because that was the giant one from this weekend as Michigan upset the Buckeyes 13-10, 3-touchdown underdogs without Colston Loveland, without Will Johnson. So we're going to sit and do a lot of analysis on this game. That was an incredible game, there's no doubt. But I'm also going to want to talk about where we're standing right now in the college football playoff, and then all of these fights and all of the emotion that we saw around college football. Certainly want to touch on that during the course of the program. But let's start in with that incredible game. Michigan taking down Ohio State. And again, the number 2 Buckeyes losing to the Michigan Wolverines, but this time in just, I would say, even more dramatic fashion because of the 3-touchdown spread. 3-touchdown underdogs. I did not see this coming, to be quite honest. I don't think a lot of people saw this coming, except for maybe some of those players and coaches within the Michigan program. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. I think that if we were really being honest with ourselves, I think that the main question about the game on Saturday would just be like, how did Michigan do this? How did they pull this off? This Wolverine team that has struggled for the better part of the year, all these new faces around their coaching staff, so many new faces on their team, and in particular in the lineup, and more specifically on offense. How did they pull this off? Well, I think that the easiest way to say this is that once again, the game was played on Michigan's terms rather than on Ohio State's terms. You see, when I first started to do this rivalry and broadcast this rivalry back in 2017, 18, 19, this game was always played on Ohio State's terms. Ohio State had the talent, and it was played on the perimeter, and Michigan could not catch up, and they would desperately try to win the matchup against Ohio State, and they couldn't because the game was played on Ohio State's terms. And now you go into 2021 and since, and all 4 of these matchups the last 4 years have been played on Michigan's terms. They want to get into a phone booth and get into a fist fight. And that's exactly what has happened over these last 4 years. And the reason that this one is so shocking is because it was so clearly out of character and in terms of a mismatch for the Ohio State Buckeyes. You see, there was 2 position groups in this game that I felt like held a pretty significant advantage over their counterpart in the game, and that was the Michigan defensive line over the Ohio State offensive line. Now, a lot of factors of that, one being Michigan's defensive line is just excellent, and I mean excellent. They are, I think, the best defensive line in the country when you have the combination of the edge rushers that they have as well as the defensive tackles. And their matchup against a beat-up and patchwork offensive line for the Buckeyes, that was a huge advantage for Michigan. So they wanted the game to be played in the trenches. They wanted those front 4 to have their say in the outcome of the game, which is exactly what happened. Now, the mismatch for Ohio State was clearly on the perimeter. Their group of wide receivers, I still maintain, is the best group of wide receivers in college football. Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Egbuka, and Carnell Tate. Those are just their top 3. They've got talented guys even behind that. They've got the 2 great running backs, Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, that on the perimeter can make plays. the defensive backfield, the secondary for Michigan, totally banged up. So they were a patchwork. Just like the Ohio State offensive line was a patchwork without Seth McLaughlin and Josh Simmons, two starters that got injured earlier this year. Well, in the secondary for Michigan, no Will Howard means that Zeke Berry's got to move out to corner. They've got some new pieces out there. You had Rod Moore tear his ACL. Like, it wasn't what it has been, and the advantage was clearly with Ohio State. Okay, so what ends up happening? Well, the game was played on the inside rather than on the perimeter. And that's a huge mistake from Ohio State's part, a huge mistake. I think back to even the game, like the game I did, Texas going to Michigan earlier in the year, and even Oregon, when I watched that game on film, didn't broadcast that game, but watched that game on film, Oregon and Texas, who I think are elite teams, two of the best teams in the country, they went and played Michigan. And granted, it wasn't the same version of Michigan, and I'll get into that in a little bit, but they played a perimeter game early in particular. And what that did is that softened Michigan up a little bit. They played some tempo on offense, and they got that starting defensive line a bit tired for Michigan. And then that's when they were able to start exploiting some of the runs later in the game. That's exactly the opposite of how the game played out against Ohio State. Okay, so in my estimation, it's about terms and whose terms the game is played on. And for the fourth straight year, Michigan got to play a game that they were completely comfortable with. And actually, in this case, desperately desired to play. And I think that the question then becomes like, why? Why was this the case? Why did Ohio State allow this game to be played this way? That's the biggest question I would have. Like, let's say if I'm an Ohio State fan, I would ask, like, why? And even if I'm a Michigan fan right now, I would think to myself, like, well, why did they allow us to do that? Because that's so fascinating. You get into the second half of that game, and again, Ohio State doesn't do anything on offense in the second half. No points for that offense in the second half. Well, two reasons why I think you can answer, like, why did that take place? Why did Ohio State, why did Ryan Day and Chip Kelly allow this game to be played on the terms that it did, and specifically in the second half? And I think it comes down to two things. The first being, I think that they had a tremendous amount of faith in their own defense, because Ohio State's defense is really good, really good. And it was very clear that Michigan was not going to drive the length of the field in order to score points. Think about the points that they got. The only reason that they had 10 points is because they got the ball first and goal inside the 5 after a Will Howard interception. And then after a short punt, when the offense didn't do anything, they gain, 5 yards, 6 yards, and kick a 50-plus yard field goal. Zvada kicks a 50-plus yard field goal. That's the only reason they have 10 points. Ohio State has given them nothing, right? So the first reason of why this game gets played in the trenches when Ohio State has the ball is because of the faith they had in their defense. I believe that they thought to themselves, there's no way they're going to score any more points. And so they started to protect themselves with some of the offensive play calls. The other factor of why, I said there was two. The first was faith in their D. And the second one is, it was pretty clear, based on the film that I watched after the game, that Will Howard was struggling and he was not seeing the game very well. And it didn't have to do solely with the injury or when he got banged up. The first interception, which you see right now on YouTube, that was the complete opposite side of the field, I should say, that he was supposed to be on. That is two high safeties and a corner that is in a jam technique and doesn't technically have deep responsibility, although he can float back. That's not necessarily quarters, but it's kind of a soft 2, and the corner has his eyes down, and he throws a pick that gives Michigan the ball inside the 5. The second interception was equally as bad, and this one, just in terms of ball placement, throwing it well behind Emeka Egbuka to the tune of 3-4 yards behind him, and more on that one a little bit later. But even more so than the 2 picks, it was the first one where he goes to the opposite side, and then in general, even when he wasn't throwing interceptions, the ball was not going to the right spot. On film, and granted, I'm not in their position rooms, So I'm not going to sit here and act like I'm PFF and going to grade him on a snap in and snap out basis. I'm not going to do that. But I do generally understand like what are zone beaters, what are open coverage beaters, and what are closed coverage beaters. And what I mean by that is like if there are two safeties in high, that's an open middle of the field. If there is one safety in the middle of the field, that's a closed middle of the field. So is it middle field open, middle field closed? I know where your eyes are supposed to go based on middle field open, middle field closed. And there were several times when Will Howard was playing the wrong side of the field. And again, sometimes even completing the pass, but it's like, that's not where the ball is supposed to go. Well, Ryan and Chip surely saw what I was seeing, and I had to wait to see it on film, but they were seeing it in real time. Because as coaches, you call a concept and you see a coverage and you know what the coaching points are, and you think to yourself, like, this is probably where the ball is going to go. And when it's not going there, it's a good indication that the quarterback is just not seeing it well. And I don't think Will was seeing it very well for the really entirety of the game. So there's this idea that I feel like those coaches, I feel like Ryan Day and Chip Kelly wanted to protect from their offense, which they didn't feel like was in rhythm. They saw that their defense was playing really well, and so they allowed the game to get taken down into a phone booth in the second half with their offense. Now, in hindsight, would they like to change that? I'm sure. But that's the only reasons why I can possibly come up with why this happened. Why in the world, would some of those things happen? And so now all of a sudden it's in the second half and it's 10-10. You've got a 10-10 ball game. You've got this idea that like, okay, our quarterback is not seeing it very well. Our defense is playing outstanding. And here's, I rarely do this, but I want to talk about one sequence in the third quarter because I think that this sequence ends up being the football game right here. I'm going to go to basically like, what is it? I think it's like 8:24 of the third quarter. And after a short punt, Ohio State comes onto the field with 8:24 in the third quarter in a 10-10 game, and they get the ball on their side of the 50-yard line. So they've got P and 10, I call it the first down. So it's 1st and 10 at the 47-yard line. And they drive right down inside of the red zone. And even some run plays, some creative run plays, and they get a little bit of rhythm going. And now it's 1st and 10 at the 19. And they gain some yards on first down, and then they run it again. And you can tell like they're kind of protecting. And now it's 3rd and 5. What is it? 3rd and 5, 3rd and 6. And that's when the second interception happens. And it was a really bad interception. You saw it earlier when we rolled the clip. If you're watching on YouTube, Emeka Egbuka it's zone coverage, right? But Emeka Egbuka makes a little bit of a break, and he just breaks into the soft spot of the zone, and Howard throws it 3 yards behind him. And it gets picked off by Makari Page. Great play by Makari Page, by the way, but the ball was egregiously behind Emeka Egbuka. So they come off of the field, and then Michigan returns the favor. And then that's the sequence that everybody is going to start talking about because Davis Warren goes out there and he throws, I believe this was on a 3rd down, and it was, and Caleb Downs picks it off. And now all of a sudden, Ohio State is right back onto the field, and you can feel the energy in the building. And what do? They run the football. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that was interesting because it was just nondescript run. Then they did a little sprint right, throw back to the tight end. And again, it's zone defense that they're playing against because Michigan's not having to play man and blitz and do any of that because they're controlling the game with the front four. And then they have a delayed handoff, a little draw play to the tailback. And of course, Mason Graham snuffs that out because they couldn't block those defensive tackles all day long. And so then all of a sudden you're like, okay, well, we're going to get our points and win the game. And Fielding misses the kick. And that's the moment that the game totally changes because the energy in the building and the energy on the far sideline from where I'm standing completely changes at that point. You see, here's what had happened, folks, is that Michigan was allowed to dominate the game with totally safe coverages because their defensive line was playing unbelievable. You have to give so much credit to Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, Josiah Stewart and TJ Guy and Derek Moore and all of these guys that played up front because they were completely controlling the game. Michigan had to, or I should say, didn't have to commit any resources to stopping the run whatsoever because their front four and the backers, Hausman and Barham, they were stifling everything. They were physical. They were getting off of blocks. They were providing enough pressure, by the way, when Ohio State needed to throw the football, that they didn't have to manipulate the coverage in order to send any resources even to get pressure on the quarterback. So that way, Michigan got to just sit in safe zone coverages the entire game. They had 2 guys over Jeremiah Smith. They had, it was 4 over 3 on one side. It was 3 over 2 on the other side. And there was not a lot of places to go with the football. So even though all of us were thinking to ourselves, like, why isn't the ball going on the perimeter? It's because the numbers suggested that they needed to run the football. But here's the problem. They could not. They could not. The mismatch up front was so thoroughly won by Michigan that it completely stifled Ohio State's offense. Those defensive tackles, I've said it all year long, like they are the 2 best defensive tackles in the country. That's the best defensive line in the country. And Ohio State's offensive line could not do anything against them. There was a couple of little wrinkles, like early in the game, they ran a little bit of an option play with Will Howard and Quinshon Judkins. And then on another one, they kind of trapped. And it was like a really unique style inside. I call it an influence trap. And they gained some yards in the third quarter. But like it was these special, unique little plays that they did in the run game that gained any yards. If they were just trying to run basic like run plays against good numbers, by the way, meaning like you can block everybody in the run front, they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. So that's why like that defense was incredible. And here's where I'll credit Wink Martindale. Early in the season, I saw a lot of exotic coverages and exotic blitzes on third down. He got more basic, which allowed his players to play. And the defense late in the year resembled more of what Jesse Mintor was doing with this defense, what Mike McDonald was doing with this defense over the last couple of years. And I got to give Wink Martindale a ton of credit, because he had to learn the college game quickly. And what he was doing early, he was not stubborn enough to do late in the season. Now, maybe injuries have to, are played into that. And I'm sure that they are with Will Johnson. But the game plan that he had against Ohio State was really brilliant. Let the guys eat up front and then stay safe in the back end. They did not allow Ohio State to get past them deep. Even when they tried a deep pass to Jeremiah Smith, like the interference wasn't the worst thing in the world. I'll be honest. It's like, that's not a terrible strategy and a very NFL strategy, by the way. An interference is a lot better than a touchdown catch. And they used that, a couple of times. I'm not saying that that was the absolute plan, but that's what the result of those attempts down the field are. So the defense is playing great. And now you get this third quarter stop, and then you get the missed field goal. And I just want to suggest, like after that kick, there's about 20 minutes left in the game, right around there. After the interception, after Will Howard's second interception, there's about 20 minutes of game time left. Ohio State ran 10 offensive plays from that point forward. 10. And that's where we get into this idea of like, Michigan knew when Fielding missed the kick that they were going to win the game. And God is my witness, they told us this during the week. This is what's so crazy is that on Wednesday, we do our calls with the Michigan coaches. And this is what they said. They said, all we hope for is a 1-score game in the fourth quarter because then we feel like we've got them and we're going to win that game. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. They didn't say that they knew they could win or that they knew that they could have a 1-score game in the fourth quarter. They said, if we can travel a really narrow path towards a 1-score game in the fourth quarter, we'll win that game. And they were very confident about that. Very confident about that. And now I know why. Because in the last 3 years, it's been very evident to them that they would be able to win physically in the fourth quarter. And they've done that for now 4 straight years. 4 straight years. You saw it in the way that they played. You saw it in the way that their offensive line just continued to grind away at the Ohio State defense. And it wasn't pretty, but guess what? They finally were able to start running the football a little bit in the fourth quarter, and Kalel Mullings was an absolute beast. He's going to go down in lore, in this matchup specifically on the Michigan side for what he did on Saturday. That 3rd and 6 that you're watching on YouTube, by the way, be a subscriber, hit the notifications. That 3rd and 6 that he bounces out to the right side and picks up the first down and gets them in field goal range, that's the game at that point. 32 carries, 116 yards, and a touchdown in the win over Ohio State. And it's like that offense is not a very good offense. All due respect to those players because they played their guts out. But man, Kalel Mullings with Donovan Edwards went out with injury. It was very clear it was either him or a true freshman. And yeah, the true freshman got a carry late, but Kalel was a beast, an absolute beast. And not in the terms of just churning out yards, but physically just giving body blow after body blow after body blow. And they knew that at some point that would pay dividends, that would pay dividends. And you look up and it's the fourth quarter. And then sure enough, they did exactly what they were able to do the last 3 years. So check this out. Check this out. They've won 4 straight games against Ohio State. And I started thinking to myself, like, man, it seems like it's the same type of ending every year for 4 straight years. And I was like, what are the rushing yards in the fourth quarter combined over the last 4 years? These 4 wins. Michigan has run the ball for 394 yards combined over the last 4 fourth quarters for, on average, 6.7 yards per carry. So now I think back to the conversations that I've had, and the coach is saying to me, like, if we're in a 1-score game in the fourth quarter, we're going to win that game. And I'm like, well, what do you mean you're going to win that game? Says who? Says history. Says history. They leaned on that. They knew it deep down in their heart. They knew that they could do that, that style would end up winning. And Ohio State played into their hands. They allowed the game to be played on the inside rather than the perimeter. That's the only way that it was going to be a 1-score game. And then there we go. And all of a sudden, they're walking out of there with a victory as a 3-touchdown underdog. And you're like, how did that happen? That's how it happened. That's how it happened. It had to happen that way, by the way. It was an incredibly narrow path. I know that there's a lot of, there's going to be, on the Ohio State side in particular, there's going to be a lot talked about in terms of coaching decisions and Ryan Day and Chip Kelly and Will Howard. And I understand that, and I get that. But the way that I just outlined, that's exactly what happened in that game. That's exactly how it happened. And now, Ryan Day, unfortunately for him, falls to 1-4 against Michigan. This guy is an incredible coach. He's 65-6 against everybody else. 65-6. And in this matchup, in particular, for whatever reason, I think that his demise in this matchup has been that it has been played on Michigan's terms. And in this one in particular, it felt like they made the decision to allow that to happen. And I kept thinking to myself, like, when is the tempo going to come? When is the perimeter game going to come? And it just never really materialized. And again, I think it comes down to two reasons. One is I don't know if they were trusting their quarterback a lot, the way that he was playing, the turnovers that he was throwing in there. And then I think that they trusted their own defense a ton. So that's how you get to that position. If you're asking yourself as a Buckeye fan, like, why in the world would they play that style of game? That's the reasons. Now, do I agree with it? No, I don't. Their most successful offensive possession was the 2-minute possession right before the half. They were forced into, because of game situation, going faster and running a lot different combination of routes than what they were trying to run the rest of the game. The rest of the game, because of the zone coverage, they were trying to run a lot of these hooks and they weren't running through the zones very much. See, in the 2-minute situation, a lot of times they were clearing zones out with vertical routes and then folding overs and other types of routes in after they would clear out some of those zones. That was working very effectively. And, even like clearing out through the slot and then bringing in a slant. And what you didn't have in really any other time during the game is that speed. What you had was a ton of curls and hooks and little under routes. You didn't have slants and posts and go routes. And it wasn't very aggressive. And I think that the hindsight for them is going to be like, we allowed that game to be a slow game. We allowed that game to be a limited possession game. We allowed that game to be played on their terms. And I think that's what they will be most frustrated about. Michigan wanted the one-score game in the fourth quarter. They got it. They believed they could win it, and they did. And I believe they understood that the narrow path had to be taken. You see, they had to play a limited possession game. If this was a high volume game, they lose that game. If it's played on the perimeter, they lose that game. I mean, they knew that. They played Texas. They played Oregon. Ohio State ran 10 plays over the final 20 minutes of that game after the Howard INT. That's crazy. Field position. They had to get that. They got 10 points starting possessions inside of Ohio State territory. One of those was inside the 5. The other was gaining 5 yards and kicking a 50-plus yard field goal. And then they had to play on their terms, and they did. All of those things had to take place, in order for Michigan to win, and it did. And I got to tell you, like, if I'm Sharon Moore, no wonder he was so happy after the game, because he got to play a slugfest, which he didn't have to talk about. Like, and this is not like who's tougher than who. It's just that Michigan knows that they can win that style. This is Sharon Moore after the game in the press conference.
That's who we are, so we don't really need to talk about it. We're built. That's how we're built. We don't talk about toughness. We don't talk about that. We how we're built in the weight room, what we do on the field, physicality, how we practice. That's just who who Michigan is. So we don't really need to talk about it.
I'll give Sharon a lot of credit because this team found themselves late in the year. It was not a pretty season for Michigan. Michigan fans, you know that. I mean, you know that. They had to do a ton of soul searching. They changed schematically a little bit. It hasn't been great. And yet, over their last 3 games, even the loss to Indiana, I think that you saw a much better version of Michigan. By the way, that Indiana win over Michigan looks a lot better now. Since that close loss to Indiana, they blew out Northwestern. They went on the road and beat the number 2 ranked team in the country. Like, this team figured it out late in the season. And now I think that they're going to be really excited moving forward. And that's where I'm going to go next, is like, what does this mean for each program, for each coach, for the future? What does Saturday mean for Michigan and Ohio State? And for Michigan, I got to tell you, there's not a 7-win team in the country that had a better last 2 weeks than Michigan. They get Bryce Underwood to flip. They've got a top 10 recruiting class. Now they just beat their rival for the 4th straight time. And here's the more important part, is that they can go into the offseason and they can double down on everything that they do. Okay. You see, this was a really important win, obviously, for Sharon for so many reasons. But the main reason is that he can say, like, no. It's not just Jim that can win this way. This is Michigan's philosophy, not Jim's philosophy, which then means that it can be my philosophy. We can go in and this can be my program, and that these foundational things about toughness and weight room and development work. This works. What we do works. That is a really powerful thing going into an offseason, because you've got to be able to lean on guys. You see, as a coach, you've got to have leverage over guys. If you feel like your players have leverage over you, then you can't require them to work as hard as they need to work in order to develop. But when you have leverage over the players, when you can say, like, what I'm requiring you to do works. We've beat Ohio State 4 straight times. We've won a national championship. We won 3 Big Ten titles. This works. Now, the offseason can be incredible. And he can point to that post-game interview with Mason Graham at his side and Jenny Taft on the field. That's basically what he said. Check it out.
What are you going to do to beat Ohio State? And you did it today. How did you do it, Coach?
These guys, man. Guys like Mason Graham, guys like Kenneth Grant, Josiah Stewart, Derek Moore, the offensive line. I mean, you talk about a gritty performance by a bunch of guys. I mean, I love these dudes. These guys are the harder program. This is why you come to Michigan. Right here, guys like this. Win this game. 3-0. Let's go, baby. Love you.
That's come to Michigan. This works. That's what that's what he's saying. And like, how about that recruiting pitch? If you're sitting in the living room of a defensive lineman, if you're sitting in the living room of an offensive lineman or running back, you're like, hey, like, this is what we do. This is what we do. And it works. So really powerful game for Michigan. And I think that's what it means for them moving forward. It is a springboard game. They can go into the offseason, and now it can be an incredibly powerful and positive offseason, even if it wasn't as successful on the field as they had wished during the fall. And I think that that's fair. Now for Ohio State. What does this mean for Ohio State? My gosh. I mean, this is what's just such a difficult conversation, because there's a sector of people out there, Ohio State people, that want, like, well, this means that, like, we've got to change. I'm not one of those. I'm really not. And it doesn't seem like your athletic director is either. Here's the weird part for Ohio State is, like, this is going to hurt a lot. And however, they are still in this thing. And there is not a great team in America. All due respect to Oregon. Ohio State already saw Oregon. Ohio State already played with Oregon in Oregon and lost by a point. And that's the unequivocal, almost unanimous number one team in the country. So Ohio State still has a very clear and open path to win the national championship. And there are times when you've got to get up and brush yourself off and push forward. I know it was an emotional loss. I fully understand that. I really do. I have been there as a player. I grew up in Colorado. I have lost to Nebraska on my senior day. I know how it feels. It's awful. It's awful. I don't want to put myself in the coach's shoes because I didn't have a family at the time. So I'm not trying to do that. I am trying to say, like, there are times as a player and as a competitor when you go through things that you don't feel like you can get up off the mat, but you have to get up off the mat because everything is still ahead of this Ohio State team. There's not a dominant team out there. And guess what? If you can learn from this game and fix some of the issues that you had in this game, and if you can not repeat them, then they could win the national championship. You see, after they lost to Oregon, I thought that they did a really good job, Ryan in particular, and the defense in particular under Jim Knowles, of transforming themselves and evolving on defense to become a better team. And they were better defensively in the back half of the year than they were in the first half of the year, and specifically than they were against that Oregon team. Okay, so that's pretty clear. Well, now you've got to do the same thing, even though it hurts bad because it's a punch right in the gut because it's Michigan, but you've got to do the same thing on the offensive side. And what is the thing that you've got to learn? You cannot get dragged into a street fight with that offense. You can't, because the offensive line is not good enough to do that. It's not good enough to do that. Ohio State has got to play on the perimeter. This cannot be a running team. It cannot be a running team in order to win the national championship. It has to be a passing team, which means they're going to have to trust Will Howard. And Will Howard's going to have to play better. Kind of a bottom line proposition. And I think that Ryan Day is going to know that after watching this film. I think that Chip Kelly is going to know that. And I think Will Howard is going to know that. There are games when Will plays really well. Saturday was not one of them. But if this team is going to reach their potential, it will be because of the passing game. It will not be because of the running game. All right. And if they try to prove that it is because of the running game, then they'll end up like this again, because there's been two games that I've actually done and sat in the booth And it felt like Ohio State was trying to be stubborn. And it was Nebraska and this game against Michigan. And in both of those cases, those two teams on their defensive side, their two best players were their defensive tackles. Nebraska and Michigan. And you look up and it's like, you can't be stubborn and just try to run the football. If running the football is not there, they've got to pivot. And they've got to find a better way to get Jeremiah Smith involved. They've got to find a better way to get Emeka Egbuka involved. And they've got to find a better way to get the ball on the perimeter and attack where they have the mismatch. Ohio State is a great team if they play on their terms. This is not a team that's going to be able to devolve into some street fight and win at the top end. And we just saw that against Michigan. So where do they go? We've seen them fix the defense before. Now it's time to fix the offense. And it's a philosophy thing. Okay. They're not going to get a new offensive line. You're not going to fix the run game. You're just not. There can be creative run game. There can be things that they can do and run on the perimeter, and you can soften people up in the middle of the defense in order to run the football more effectively, but it's not going to be a running team. They need to move away from that. They need to move away from that quickly. And if they make that fix, then I think that they can have something moving forward. Okay, now we've got to get into the fight. Oh my gosh. We've talked about this game for, 25 minutes now, and we haven't even talked about the fight. Okay. The fight. Let me talk first about college football. Okay. Part of the reason that college football is so spectacular is because of the tribalism of our sport. You see, college football is blood. It's family. All right. It is not corporate. It's not professional sports. Now, I know people think like, oh, it's becoming that way, but no, it will never be that way. I don't care how much money the players end up making, which it's probably going to be significant, in particular once we get into revenue share. It still will be tribal, it still will be organic, and it still will be blood and family. And the reason is because it is the most unique sport in the world, period. People can say all they want about the tribalism of European soccer, and I understand that. No, I do. And listen, that's wild. That's wild. However, this is why college football is more unique than that. It's because none of those fans in the stands, whether it's Premier League soccer or the NFL or any other professional sport, not one fan can sit in the stands or watch on TV and say, I am a Kansas City Chief. I am Arsenal. Can't do that. However, all of these fans in college football, almost all of them, can say, I am a Wolverine. I am a Buckeye. I am a Buffalo. It's part of my identity. It's part of my life. Not just because I choose to root for that team. No. It's because that is where I became me. My identity is in part a Buff, a Buckeye, a Wolverine, a volunteer. That's why our sport is so incredible. It's so incredible. Now, why do I position it that way before talking about this fight? Well, because I don't think that you can accurately talk about the emotions after a game that way unless you understand the emotions of the game and of the teams. And we love college football because it is played on an emotional red line. And it's more emotional than professional sports. We don't get this type of passion and intensity at the next level as we do in college. Because again, these rivalries, these colors, these songs, these traditions are part of who we are. Okay? It's part of who we are. And because of that, we love the sport. But because of that, it operates right on the red line. And so when you get into rivalry weekend, what do you get? Emotions overflowing. And we didn't just see it in Columbus and the Horseshoe. We saw it all over college football. Okay. And I know that there are some that are up in arms about what has gone on this weekend in college football. And guess what? We cannot love the sport because it's played on the emotional red line and then want to chastise those who play it on the emotional red line. We cannot do that. I do believe that that's disingenuous. Part of what made this weekend great is what also made it sad. And you can't have one without the other. So the fabric of our sport is going to lend itself to this. You see, I understand the emotions of both sides of what happened on Saturday in the Horseshoe. That's why I said what I did to Gus. I cannot lay blame on either side because I understand the emotions from each side of the players. Now, was it unfortunate? Absolutely. Do I want to see this? No, I don't at all. But at the same time, who am I to sit there and say like, oh, throw them all out, discipline everybody? Listen, I wish the authorities would have been more prepared. I really do. And I thought it was just sad to see it devolve into a situation where there was pepper spray used. Do I think that like flags should be out? Probably not, in these emotionally charged environments, or pitchforks or whatever. And did Steve Sarkisian handle it really well down in College Station after seeing what he did on TV in the Horseshoe? Yes. And like, do I want to see that? No, but I'm sorry. I can't sit here and chastise these kids for being this emotional when that's exactly why we love the sport in the first place. I can't do that. Okay. And we see these flag plants all the time. Texas did it to Michigan earlier in the season. Baker Mayfield has done it. Like this happens in college football. And I understand the feeling of feeling we're not going to allow that to happen on our field. So again, I'm not saying Ohio State is wrong, and I'm not saying Michigan is wrong. I'm saying like this is the unfortunate side of loving a sport that is going to be played on the emotional red line, and there's no other game that is played closer to that emotional red line than Michigan, Ohio State. I've been a part of a lot of broadcasts over a long time. I've done Red River rivalries and I've done big games and I've done a lot of things in my career. Nothing comes close to the intensity of this rivalry. The intensity of the pressure that each team feels from its own fan base and from the opposite side of the field. It is totally unique and it is uniquely intense. And what you saw was all of that spill out. All of it spill out. That was a supercharged environment. It was an ugly scene. I wish it wouldn't have taken place. But I can't sit here and chastise those involved when I've felt the same things. And in particular, why I love the sport for being so emotional and so tribal and thicker than blood. And like, that's why I love it. So that's my whole thought on that. That's my whole thought. I'm not going to sit here and chastise everybody on that. Now, if you want to say like, hey, let's take flags away from everybody. Okay, that's fine. If you want to say like in these rivalry games, should we have authorities out there, faster? Sure. I guess so. But I don't think that conferences should get involved in this. Just is what it is. Let's move on to the college football playoff because everything that happened over the course of the weekend had a giant impact on the postseason. And this postseason is going to be great, and it's made the regular season incredible. I continue to harp on this thought about how this regular season has been as good as any that I can remember, and in large part due to the expanded playoff because there's so many teams playing huge games. So here's what I want to do, and it's kind of piggybacking off of a tweet that I sent out on Saturday night. And I sent out my rankings, which, everybody hates. That's fine. I think it's more interesting to start talking about like who's in and who's out, who's in, who's on the bubble. in this college football playoff. That's more interesting than rankings. Rankings really don't matter at this point. So let's play a little bit of a game here. I think that there are teams that are in, 8 of them. I think that there are 3 more spots that are going to be automatic spots that we can talk about, and it's going to leave 1 at-large spot. So let's kind of go through this. Let's walk through this. I believe that there are 8 teams that are currently in the college football playoff. Oregon is in. That's pretty clear. They beat Washington. They've been really good. Texas, they're in. Penn State, I think they're in. Notre Dame, that's pretty clear. Ohio State, even after that loss, they're clearly in. Georgia is in. Even with a loss in the SEC championship game, if they were to lose, would still be in. Tennessee is in. Indiana is in. Okay, so quickly on any of those teams, the Texas A&M game, I thought it wasn't even indicative of the score. Texas was a lot better than 17-7 better than Texas A&M. In fact, the only reason you're getting that score is that tipped pick 6. Texas was dominant. That defense is very good. I think at their best, Texas is probably my pick to win the national championship, because I think at their very best, they might be better than anybody else. It's tough to go against Oregon right now. I still think Ohio State at their best is very good if they play their own game and not on the terms of their opponent. So those are my 3 kind of favorites in there. I don't believe Georgia is one of my favorites, not after what I saw against Georgia Tech. We have seen too many times now during the course of the year that this Georgia team is just not very good. Now, that's relatively speaking, and that's probably more comparative to what they have been over the last couple of years. But that game, what was a Friday night against Georgia Tech? I mean, total survive. By the way, Georgia Tech, go for 2 in the first overtime. What are we doing? As soon as that game extended past the first overtime, the chances that Georgia Tech was going to win was not very solid. Haynes King played incredible. That was a really great game. Good comeback from Georgia. Unfortunate fumble there with about 2 minutes to go, which really cost Georgia Tech. And Georgia Tech, man, they almost beat Georgia. They beat Florida State. Who else they beat? They beat Miami. If you would have told them, let's say they would have beaten Georgia. If you would have told Brent Key before the year, you're going to beat Florida State, Miami, and Georgia, he would have been like, sign me up. Now, they didn't get it done against Georgia, but boy, that was an incredible game. And funny how Kirby didn't get on a soapbox afterwards in an interview and talk about how difficult it was to win in the SEC. Funny how that works when Georgia Tech comes in there and takes you right to your limit. How all of a sudden it wasn't tough to win in the SEC that night. So that's interesting. Texas wins over A&M. Penn State beat Maryland, by the way. Penn State kind of hammered Maryland and scored late. James Franklin was asked about it later. Apparently Mike Loxley took exception with it. I agree with James Franklin in this case. You heard what he said. If your 2s and 3s are in, they deserve to play hard. They go about their day. They go about their business. If they get into the football game, they deserve to be put into a situation and position to succeed. So I'm with James Franklin on that one. There's no doubt. Notre Dame took out USC. Notre Dame is quietly very good. If they could just throw it a little better, I would be very high on Notre Dame, but that team is playing really well. And I was actually surprised that USC was able to play so well on the offensive side against that Notre Dame defense. But Notre Dame puts up 49 again. The offense has been just really good, scoring a lot of points here in the back half of the year. Tennessee, congratulations, Vol fans. I know we have a tenuous, is that a tenuous relationship, Vol fans and I'm happy for you. In fact, we have a huge Vol fan on the staff, and I'm hoping that you get a home game so that she can go down there to Knoxville and go to the game. That would be awesome. I would love to see a playoff game in Knoxville. I think that would be great. We'll see how the seeding comes out. Indiana, I do think, is in. If you look at Indiana's resume, after everything that has happened, that's not a bubble team. They win 66-0 against Purdue, who ends up firing Ryan Walters after the season, which, by the way, Purdue, don't fire Ryan Walters. What are you doing? You gave him zero help. You didn't give him any resources in 2 years at a place that's really hard to win. And yeah, it's his problem that you gave him no resources in NIL and he loses Scorton and he loses all of his players. Give me a break. That's the bummer side of college athletics. But Indiana beats them 66-0. And now Indiana is sitting there. Their losses to Ohio State at Ohio State. Their 11 wins are by an average of 33 points per game. They have a one win by less than 14, and that was Michigan, which looks a lot better now after Michigan knocked off Ohio State. And if the strength of schedule is where you're sitting, it doesn't look as bad as what people would anticipate. Their strength of schedule is 65. Yeah, it's not great, but SMU's is 75. Miami's is 55. Notre Dame's is 57. All of those teams right in there with Indiana. So that's how I get to the 8. Again, we'll flash that back up there. 8 teams are in right now in the college football playoff. I think firmly, and I don't believe that there's a lot of controversy with these 8. I'll go over them again. Oregon, Texas, Penn State, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Georgia, Tennessee, and Indiana. We'll see how the seeding comes out and who's going to get home games, but those 8 are in. Now, there's 3 more spots. 3 more spots are going to be automatically given out, and these 3 goes as follows. The ACC champ, which is going to be SMU or Clemson. You've got the Big 12 champ, which is Arizona State or Iowa State. And then you've basically got the Mountain West champ, basically, Boise State or UNLV, unless Boise loses and Tulane is ranked high. You get all of this stuff. Like, you get what I mean. You've got the group of 5 champ that's going to be in, likely going to be Boise State if they're able to beat UNLV in the Mountain West championship game. So those 3 would be in. That leaves us with 1 spot. I believe that there is basically 1 spot up for grabs, and we probably will know that spot, although not completely, after this week's rankings. There is one game that I do think can affect the bubble, and we'll get into that in just a second. We'll get into it right now. SMU, if they lose to Clemson, would be a bubble team. So Clemson could play themselves in with a win in the ACC championship game because they are playing against SMU. So if SMU were to lose that game, they would be on the bubble. Then you would get the 3 SEC teams that everybody is talking about right now, Alabama, Ole Miss, and South Carolina. And then maybe Miami is also a bubble team. Although I do think that if you look at the resumes, even though they're a 2-loss team versus those 3-loss SEC teams, I don't love their case. Now, the committee has liked Miami a lot more than I have and a lot more than I think that they should have, but they've liked them a lot. So we'll see where Miami falls to after that loss to Syracuse on Saturday. But there's the bubble. You've got 5 teams on the bubble, and one of them is only if they lose, which would be SMU as a loser in the ACC championship game. It'd be interesting to see like how they would penalize or not penalize SMU for getting into that game. Like, for instance, SMU would likely be in now, and now they have to play an extra game. Does that extra game in an ACC championship game definitely knock them out? That's fascinating. Then you're going to get to see, how does the committee view these 3 SEC teams, Alabama, Ole Miss, South Carolina. And what I can't stand, I just can't. Like, the politics season is just so frustrating. We hear it from Kirby all the time. We used to hear it from Nick Saban. It's the only thing that Nick Saban ever did that I was just like, come on, man. Like, we don't need you soapboxing. I get why they do it. I understand it. I just don't love it. And now Lane Kiffin is out there, and he's kind of taking up that torch, and now he's doing it through Twitter because he's new age, right? He doesn't have to do it in his post-game press conferences. He does it on Twitter. And basically, he just screenshotted the opposition research that he was handed by some assistant with all these details about, Ole Miss has 9 wins, outscoring their opponents 390-94, plus 296. Alabama's margin's only plus 252. It's like, Lane, come on. And I will tell you this. You know what I love? I love when someone trolls him right back. So Brett Bielema, well done, sir. Brett Bielema chimes in, folks, and he just throws out there right on Twitter. He says, couldn't agree more, Lane Kiffin. Here's a thought for the college football playoff. And he lists some superlatives about Illinois. And I love it. He starts throwing out strength of schedule and losses and this and that. Now, does Illinois have a resume that can challenge Ole Miss? No, because they don't have the wins that would challenge Ole Miss. Remember, Ole Miss has got the win against Georgia. That's obviously going to count for a lot more, but I just love that Brett Bielema trolls him right back. I wish that we were done with political season back in November, but apparently we're not. And that's essentially what we've got. So that's the bubble. Where do I think we're going to fall on the bubble? Well, folks, I'm not telling you this, that I love this. I am telling you this. This is what I think is going to happen. I believe that the last team in the playoff is going to be Alabama. It's just what I believe. Now, you can argue all you want that Ole Miss should be in there. I do believe, based on how they've treated Indiana and SMU at times and other teams that don't have the brand of others, brand can carry the day. And the path of least resistance, in this case, I think would be Alabama. Now, that's a prediction. That's not what I'm arguing for. That's just a prediction. I think that Alabama is going to go to the college football playoff as the 12th seed. Unless Clemson were to win, and then they'd probably be the 12th seed, and you get what I'm saying. Even if SMU loses, I think Alabama is going to go. And I think that's going to break people's minds. I really do. Folks, I think that this weekend was incredible of college football. I think it is why we love the sport. I pinch myself when I get to do games like that. I know that it was supercharged and it was very intense. Thought about this show all weekend before I've been recording it, about what I would say and how I would say it about Michigan and Ohio State, because those two fan bases are intense and they're passionate about their team, but that's what makes them great. That's what makes them great. My only hope is that we keep some level of perspective that this is a sport. It is not life and death. And I just don't believe that we should be treating any coaches' families differently because of outcomes in this game. And I firmly believe that. I love this sport. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Remember to subscribe on YouTube. Remember to hit the notifications button if you would. Remember to follow us on social media at Joel Klatt Show, wherever you like your social media. We'll be back on Tuesday night. We'll record on Tuesday night. Wednesday, you can check out our full playoff reaction. We'll see if I was correct with these 8 teams in, with the 3 at-larges that we're about to get, with the conference championship games, and then what does the bubble look like? We will talk about all of that on Wednesday morning right here at the Joel Klatt Show.